So the title for the talk is Facebook and the Anger-Eating Demon. Is social media making us stupid? So the idea for this talk was stimulated by an American called Jonathan Haidt. So he's a well-known Western social psychologist based at the New York University Stern School of Business. And as well as an extensive record of academic publications, he's the author of several best-selling books written for a popular audience. He's written books such as The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, and he's co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Now, although his research is very much based in the United States, much of his work and his ideas have wider relevance for all westernized countries. And just under a year ago, in May 2022, he published a major article in the United States magazine called The Atlantic, and the title of that article was Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid. Now again, although the article's focus is very much on the United States, I believe that what he has written has wider relevance beyond the United States. The article is his analysis of what is going wrong in American life and the part played in that by social media. In the article, he is most concerned to identify the causes of the problem. He admits he doesn't have yet any solutions. The solutions are yet to be found. And when I was reflecting on Haidt's article and preparing this talk, I was strongly reminded of two teachings given 2,500 years ago by the Buddha. One concerning an anger-eating demon, and the other concerning darts. I'll say more about those teachings later, but first of all, here's a summary of Jonathan Haidt's argument in the Atlantic magazine article. He starts by reminding us of the excitement and promise of the early internet. And this is something that I personally remember very, very well. Because in the 1970s and the 1980s, I worked as a researcher for trade unions in the UK. I worked closely with journalists who specialised in the field of employment relations. They worked for The Guardian, The Times and the Financial Times newspapers. And if a topic came up that required research, like me, those journalists would head to their organisation's library to find a folder. And that folder would contain physical copies of previous articles on that topic. And people were employed in those libraries to do a daily scan of many publications, newspapers, magazines, and so on, literally cutting out or photocopying articles linked to different issues and physically storing them in folders. That's how we did research. And in the early 1990s, therefore, I was thrilled to be involved in the first organisational attempts by national and international trade unions to use the newly emerging World Wide Web to explore new ways to find and share information. And I remember being bitterly disappointed at how little information the first primitive search engines came up with. There was no Google in those days. It was a world away from what we are used to now. Nevertheless, I knew it had great promise. And on a more personal level, moving forward in time, I also remember in the early 2000s successfully using a new UK website called Friends Reunited, I think it's now extinct, to find old school friends. And then later, as social media developed, I remember watching the unfolding of the Arab Spring of 2011 and the role played in that by the internet and the social media. So there is much of great benefit from the development of the internet and the social media. And yet, Jonathan Haidt argues, social media has played a major role in what he sees as the fracturing and fragmentation of American society. He asks, what binds and sustains successful democracies? He says that such democracies need three basic qualities: extensive social networks with high levels of trust, strong institutions, and shared stories. Social media, he says, has weakened all three, and he highlights two ways in which this weakening has happened. First, he argues, social media platforms encourage people to spend more time performing and less time connecting. People engage in activities online that might impress others, but do not deepen friendships in the way that a private phone call will. And this weakens the deeper bonds of friendship and community. Second, in 2010, Facebook introduced the like and share buttons, and early in 2016 added reaction options including love and angry. And in 2009, Twitter added the retweet button. And from the like and share and retweet and other buttons, Facebook and Twitter began internally to produce data about what most engaged individual users, and from this data, were able to develop algorithms to bring and highlight content to individual users that was most likely to generate likes or shares or retweets. And with more likes and shares and retweets came a vastly bigger growth in the usage of their platforms, and with this growth came much bigger sales of advertisements and much bigger profits. And moreover, and this is really important, Jonathan Haidt argues, research indicated to Facebook and Twitter that the posts most likely to be shared and retweeted were those that triggered strong emotions, especially anger, and their algorithms adapted accordingly. In the pursuit of profit, Facebook and Twitter became anger-making machines. And in this way, Haidt argues, social media changed dramatically during the 2010s compared to its earlier incarnations. Social media became a new game with a viral nature that encouraged dishonesty and mob dynamics. Users were not guided just by their true preferences, but by their past experiences of reward and punishment, and their prediction of how others would react to each new posting. In this way, Haidt argues, the platforms were almost perfectly designed to bring out our most moralistic and least reflective selves. Social media platforms encouraged a waste of time and of our scarce attention. In Haidt's words, they managed to dissolve the motor of trust, belief in institutions, and shared stories that had held a large and diverse secular democracy together. And he reflects that a mean tweet or comment doesn't kill anyone, but it can shame or punish someone publicly while broadcasting your own virtue, brilliance, or tribal loyalties. And he uses a metaphor to describe such mean tweets or comments. It's more a dart than a bullet. It causes pain, but no fatalities. Even so, between 2009 and 2012, Facebook and Twitter passed out roughly 1 billion dart guns globally. We've been shooting each other ever since. Yes, Haidt acknowledges, it's important to recognize that some have been brought to account for their misdeeds in politics, in business, and in other spheres of life through social media. At the same time, though, social media, he argues, deputizes everyone to administer justice with no due process. As a result of mob dynamics, innocent people can get hurt and can lose their jobs. And moreover, recent research shows that social media gives more power and voice to political extremes while reducing the power and voice of a moderate majority. Good citizens, Haidt argues, are silenced in the face of trolls and provocateurs, and because of a chronic fear of getting darted, people begin to self-censor their contributions. And he also worries in particular about the effects of social media on adolescents. He points to the surge in rates of anxiety, depression, and self-harming amongst American and amongst Canadian and British teenagers that began in the early 2010s. Evidence suggests that social media made a major contribution to this surge. So that's a summary, if you like, of Haidt's article. Now, when I look back in time, what I see and what you could see is that both Buddhists and non-Buddhists tried to warn of the potential danger of the internet, of emerging social media. I'm going to start with an example from 30 years ago. Sangharakshita, our Buddhist teacher, speaking in 1993, and he gave 15 points of advice to members of the Triratna Buddhist order. And his first point was reduce input. Reduce input. He commented, I do not know anything about computers, so this point is not intended to have anything to do with them. Now, he may not have realized it, but in practice, I would argue, his remarks have everything now for us to do with computers and the just beginning IT revolution of his time. Like many others in the early 1990s, Sangharakshita was not aware of what was about to happen with the IT revolution. What he was talking about was disturbance from a variety of sources, including television and radio and newspapers. He warned that we do not realize the great detrimental effect such input can have upon our minds. That's why, he argued, we need to reduce input. Now, 1993, of course, was a very, very different world. The IT revolution was just getting going. Cell phones, I didn't know anybody who had a cell phone in those days, but they were a relatively recent phenomenon. Email and the World Wide Web were still in their infancy. There were no smartphones, no Facebook, no YouTube, no Twitter. And this is interesting. I didn't know this, the first SMS text message was sent from one mobile phone to another in Helsinki in 1993, 30 years ago. Well, that was a major revolution, a text message. And yet, what Sangharakshita said then is really significant. He said this: we are a sort of receiving station all the time. But we do not have to allow these different factors and influences to play on us constantly without any sort of control or restriction. But of course, others had different ideas. Later in the 1990s, Dr. Eric Schmidt, who became the chief executive officer of Google, forecast that the 21st century would be synonymous with what he called the attention economy, and that the most successful global companies would be those that would maximize the number of eyeballs they could consistently connect with and control. Moving on, in 2009, American Buddhist Andrew Olendzki reminded us that the Buddha warned, "I know of no single thing more conducive to great harm than an unrestrained mind. A mind whose energy is dispersed in several directions loses its strength and purpose." And an image in the Pali Canon, the early collection of the teachings of the Buddha, compares the flow of consciousness to a mountain stream flowing swiftly downhill. If there are several outlets through which the water is dispersed, then when the water reaches the plain, it will be little more than a trickle. It is, however, in the interest of the commercial internet to have us shifting our minds rapidly from one thing to another, to absorb, however briefly, more and more input. Writing in 2007, Nicholas Carr, former executive editor of the Harvard Business Review, commented, "The idea that our minds should operate as high-speed data processing machines is not only built into the workings of the internet, it is the network's reigning business model as well. The faster we surf across the web, the more links we click and pages we view, the more opportunities Google and other companies gain to collect information about us and to feed us advertisements. Most of the proprietors of the commercial internet have a financial stake in collecting the crumbs of data we leave behind as we flit from link to link. The more crumbs, the better. The last thing these companies want is to encourage leisurely reading or slow, concentrated thought. It's in their economic interest to drive us to distraction. The last thing these companies want is to encourage leisurely reading or slow, concentrated thought. It's in their economic interest to drive us to distraction. So the attention economy drives the mind towards more impulsive desire, away from reflection and contemplation, away from focus, and towards a scattering of our consciousness. But earlier in this talk, I promised that I would take a look at two teachings given by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, one concerning an anger-eating demon and the other concerning darts. I'm going to take the Buddha's teaching on darts first, because Jonathan Haidt plays great play of dart guns and darts. So the Buddha's teaching uses a simile concerning darts to distinguish between a person with insight and a person without insight. Both a person with insight and a person without insight experience painful physical pain. The Buddha was no different from this. As he grew old, awakened though he was, he experienced physical pain. By having a human body, no one can avoid physical pain. But a person with insight and a person without insight respond differently to painful physical sensations. The person without insight reacts to the physical pain with aversion, and on top of the physical pain, also experiences a painful mental feeling of sorrow, resentment, anger, and distress. And the Buddha uses a simile to stress this point. The Buddha says, suppose they were to strike someone with a dart, and then strike them immediately afterwards with a second dart, so that they would feel a feeling caused by two darts. So too, when a person without insight experiences a painful feeling, he feels two feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. In contrast, a person with insight endures the painful physical feeling patiently, without sorrow, resentment, anger, and distress. Returning to the simile of the dart, the Buddha comments, suppose they were to strike someone with a dart, but they would not strike them immediately afterwards with a second dart, so that they would feel a feeling caused by one dart only. So too, when a person with insight experiences a painful feeling, he feels one feeling, a bodily one, and not a mental one. So commenting on this teaching by the Buddha, Bhikkhu Bodhi writes this, while bodily existence is inevitably bound up with physical pain, such pain need not trigger the emotional reactions of misery, fear, resentment, and distress with which we habitually respond to it. Through mental training, we can develop the mindfulness and clear comprehension necessary to endure physical pain courageously with patience and with equanimity. Through insight, we can develop sufficient wisdom to overcome our dread of painful feelings and our need to seek relief in distracting binges of sensual self-indulgence. Problem is that social media is designed to drive us away from the path to insight and towards distraction by multiplying the sources of emotional pain. Social media has equipped us with the ability to fire darts into each other, causing emotional reactions of misery, fear, resentment, and distress, even as it distracts us into binges of sensual indulgence. But what of the anger-eating demon? So ancient Indian and Buddhist mythology is full of other forms of beings. And amongst them are beings called yakas. They're kind of tree or nature spirits. They can fly through the air. They can be mischievous and malicious demons, or they can be helpful beings. They can even be converted to become followers of the Buddha that gain insight. In the Samyutta Nikaya, this is the connected discourses of the Buddha tells his followers a story about one particular mischievous yaka, one particular mischievous demon. And at the start of the story, as the Buddha tells it, all of the gods of Indian mythology are assembled in a great hall, waiting for Indra, the lord of the gods, to come and sit on his great throne at the front of the hall. And the Buddha continues, once in came an ugly yaka, who sat himself down on the throne of Indra, Lord of the gods. The gods were appalled by this mischievous behavior and started to shout and grumble and complain. But the more they shouted and grumbled and complained, the more the Yaka became handsome and comely and grew and became more and more graceful. Utterly confused, some of the gods rushed off to find Indra and told him what was happening. And Indra said to them, "That must be an anger-eating Yaka. That must be an anger-eating Yaka." So Indra comes into the hall, goes up to the throne where the Yaka is seated. And he's very handsome now, very good looking, this Yaka. So Indra arranges his robe over one shoulder and he kneels down in front of the Yaka on his right knee with his hands raised in greeting. Then 3 times he repeats, "I, dear sir, am Indra, Lord of the gods. I, dear sir, am Indra, Lord of the gods." And as he spoke this, the Yaka became smaller and smaller and more ugly. And as he became more and more ugly and deformed, he shrank and suddenly he disappeared completely. So Indra then turns to the assembled gods and he gives them these verses. "I am not one afflicted in mind, nor easily drawn by anger's whirl. I never become angry for long, nor does anger persist in me. When I'm angry, I do not speak harshly, and I don't praise my own virtues. I keep myself well restrained out of regard for my own good." Now, I believe those verses by Indra, as told by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, contain very wise advice on how to participate on social media. Have a mind that is not easily drawn into a spiral of anger. Let go of reactivity. Use speech that is kind and harmonious and careful. Do not moralize from on high. Restrain your mind, not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others. So if only we could all be like Indra. If only we could all be like the Buddha. And I have to admit that when I was a regular participant on Facebook, I didn't always live up to Indra's standards. That's why several years ago I made the personal decision, to withdraw completely from Facebook. And it was a great relief. My life changed very much for the better when I withdrew from Facebook. Moving to a conclusion, I'm not sure, and neither is Jonathan Haidt, that we can easily and quickly overcome the power of modern social media. I'm afraid that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media platforms have created a giant, worldwide anger-eating Yaka that feeds on and itself feeds the worst in people. I agree with Jonathan Haidt that it's going to take great ingenuity and time and collective action to undermine the power of that demon. But maybe there is one small thing I can suggest. This came to my attention just as I finished writing the first draft of this talk. You finish a talk and you think it's finished, and then something comes in and you think, aha, I've got to find a way to include that. So just as I was finishing the first draft, an article was published that stopped me and made me think. It did offer a small step that we might like to consider, that just might help a little bit to weaken the fragmentation and distraction caused by our modern digital world. The article is called "The Case for Digital Minimalism," and it's written by an American woman called Talia Barnes. So in this article, Talia Barnes explains why she has given up her smartphone and instead uses separate pieces of digital equipment for different tasks. So if she wishes to listen to music, she uses her iPod. If she wishes to take photos, she uses her camera. If she's going somewhere in a car and she's not sure where she's going, she uses a separate GPS device, and so on. She writes, "Smartphones are good at multitasking, but human beings are bad at multitasking. Multitasking on a smartphone leads to distraction, to less focus, and worse communications between people. Using single-purpose digital devices minimizes distraction, increases focus, and improves the quality of human interactions." She writes this, "This decision to give up my smartphone has improved my quality of life. While doing less, I think more, engaging deeply in the task at hand. This experience recalls a time when devices were tools used to accomplish specific objectives and accomplish them well. To expand our attention, not to demand our attention. To expand our attention, not to demand our attention." And she describes how in a small residential private school in the United States, they banned smartphones. Instead, all students and staff members were given a phone that could only be used for calls or sending text messages. She writes that pupils and staff were very appreciative of the experience. Staff noticed the positive impact upon the behaviour of their pupils. Pupils were less anxious and more confident. But all pupils and staff were clear that once away from the closed community of the school, they would return to using their smartphones. It was, they said, much easier to commit to not using smartphones when everyone else in the community was doing the same. Talia Barnes concluded, "These testimonies suggest that major social change takes a village. Major social change takes a village. It needs the shared commitment of a community." Maybe we get a glimpse of how this might work in a community when we go on retreat. And if the retreat organisation is as it should be, you hand over your smartphones and computers, doing without the internet and any kind of digital connection for the duration of the retreat, so that you can concentrate on being with each other and be quiet. But I don't know, I have no easy answer how we might create a village, a community like that in everyday life. That's something that we're going to have to figure out. So I'll finish there.